9,000 workers, 16 plants, one in every 3 children's garments sold in America. Health-tex. The orange label mothers reached for without thinking. The clothes durable enough to outlast 3 siblings and still look worth passing along. Then the debt arrived. A billion-dollar acquisition forced the parent company to sell. A leveraged buyout turned 60 years of trust into collateral for borrowed money. 3 main plants padlocked in a single January, more than 1,000 women, home from the sewing floor with no warning. 11 more plants closed within 2 years. The brand that once commanded $347 million in sales was sold for $29 million to a conglomerate that kept the name and let the factories go. Today, Health-tex is sold exclusively at Walmart. The discount shelf its founder spent his career keeping it off. The clothes are still in drawers across America, still intact, still outlasting the children who wore them. This is the story of Louis Rousk, the garment salesman who built a company around a promise to American mothers, and of the financial machinery that dismantled everything behind the promise, while the promise itself kept holding. Not because the product failed, because the covenant did. Every American parent over a certain age knows this feeling. You're cleaning out a closet, or you're helping your mother pack up the old house, and you open a drawer you haven't opened in years. Inside, folded tight, is a child's garment, a romper, a pair of cotton pants, a little sweatshirt with knees that should have given out 2 children ago. The fabric is still intact. The stitching hasn't loosened. The tag and the collar is faded, but you can still read it. Health-tex. You remember. Your mother remembers. Her mother might remember too. 3 generations of American women bought these clothes because they didn't have to buy them twice. Hand-me-downs weren't just possible with Health-tex. They were the point. A garment purchased for a firstborn in September could survive that child, survive a younger sibling, survive a cousin, and still look like something you wouldn't be ashamed to pass along to a neighbor. That wasn't an accident. It was the entire business model. The company that made those clothes was born in 1921 in a Manhattan workshop that smelled of cotton bolt and sizing starch. Its founder was a 30-year-old garment salesman named Louis Rousk, and he didn't start with a vision for the most trusted children's clothing brand in America. He started with a sewing machine, a rented floor, and a conviction that nobody was making children's clothes well enough. He called his company the Standard Romper Company. The name said everything about where the ambition lived. Not in fashion, not in luxury, but in the romper itself. He sold flannel pajamas, creepers, and little cotton rompers to small apparel shops in the Northeast under a label that read Stantogs. The garments were plain, practical, built for the way children actually lived, on their knees, in the dirt, dragged through puddles, pulled over heads by impatient mothers at bedtime, shoved into laundry bags at the end of days that had been harder on the fabric than anyone would have guessed. Rousk understood something the rest of the children's clothing industry hadn't bothered to learn. Mothers weren't shopping for fashion. They were shopping for survival. A child's wardrobe wasn't a style statement. It was an endurance test, one that most garments on the market were failing, season after season, seam after seam. Rousk built his company around the radical idea that the test could be passed, and for 60 years it was. That understanding would carry a small Manhattan workshop into 16 plants, 9,000 workers, and a third of the entire American children's clothing market. It would make Health-tex a household name spoken in the same breath as trust itself. It would put the orange label into more American children's drawers than any competitor could match. And it would make the company, the plants, the workers, the brand, the whole living system, worth taking apart. Louis Rousk came to the garment trade the way most people did in early 20th century New York, through the only door that was open. He'd worked as a children's clothing salesman before he ever ran a sewing floor, and those years on the road gave him something no factory foreman could teach. He knew what mothers complained about. He knew which seams split first, which fabrics shrank, which buttons came loose after 3 washes and ended up in a toddler's mouth. He knew that the women buying children's clothing weren't comparing labels in a magazine. They were comparing disappointments. Standard Romper's first products were simple: flannel pajamas, cotton creepers, rompers cut for children up to age 4. Rousk sold them personally to small apparel shops in New York and New England, walking the streets with a sample case, making the same pitch in every store. These garments would last. No department store accounts, No national advertising, no ambitions beyond the immediate and practical. Find a shopkeeper, show her the product, let the fabric speak for itself. The pitch worked because the product worked. Women who bought one standard romper garment came back for the next. The shopkeepers noticed. Repeat customers are the quietest kind of advertisement, but they're the kind that keeps a small manufacturer alive through lean seasons. By the mid 1920s, Rousk had built enough of a name among small retailers that he could begin expanding. More styles, more sizes, more of the sturdy cotton garments that mothers reached for without hesitation. By the late 1920s, standard romper had outgrown its Manhattan floor. The product line stretched into play clothes for children up to age 7. Sturdy cotton pants, matching tops, the kind of practical, hard-wearing pieces that would look the same after 20 washes as they did on the shelf. Rousk leased showrooms in Chicago and San Francisco, turning a local children's wear operation into a company with a national reach. Orders came from stores in the Midwest, the West Coast, places Rousk had never personally visited. The sample case had done its work. Now the product was doing it alone. It wasn't glamorous work. Children's clothing occupied one of the least prestigious corners of the American garment industry. The money was in women's fashion, in department store ready-to-wear, in the labels that made the society pages. Nobody wrote profiles of men who sewed rompers. But Rousk had found something the fashion houses didn't have. A customer who came back every year, every child, every growth spurt. Mothers who trusted a label, didn't switch. They didn't need to be sold again. They just reached for the same tag in the same store, season after season, and the garment did the rest of the selling. In 1937, Rousk gave that trust a name. He registered Health-tex as a brand, meant to signal the quality of the textiles themselves, healthy cotton and wool, fabrics chosen for durability and softness against a child's skin. The name had nothing to do with healthcare or medicine. It was a textile promise, plain and specific. A mother reading the label was supposed to understand, without explanation, that the cloth itself had been selected with her child's comfort in mind. The Stantogs label survived alongside Health-tex for decades, appearing on garments well into the 1970s. But it was Health-tex that entered the American vocabulary. By the 1940s, Rousk's company had moved well beyond pajamas and rompers into a full range of children's playwear, overalls, jackets, matching coordinated sets in cotton and wool, all built to the same uncompromising specification, durable enough to outlast the child who wore it. The war years didn't slow the business the way they slowed more materials-dependent industries. Cotton was rationed, but children still grew, and mothers still needed clothing that could keep up. Health-tex adapted, trimmed its lines where necessary, and emerged from the war with its customer base intact and its reputation strengthened. The post-war baby boom did the rest. Between 1946 and 1960, the number of American children under 10 years old surged by millions, and every one of them needed clothes. Health-tex was positioned exactly where that wave would hit, in the stores where new mothers shopped, with the product those mothers had been raised to trust. Rousk protected the brand the way he'd built it, carefully, almost stubbornly. He refused to sell through large discount stores, believing that the presence of Health-tex on a bargain rack would cheapen the name he'd spent 2 decades constructing. Instead, he placed the garments in specialty children's shops and mid-tier department stores, the kind of places where a mother browsing the racks already expected to pay a little more for something that worked. The strategy wasn't about exclusivity for its own sake. It was about context. Health-tex couldn't mean the best if you could find it on a discount table next to irregular socks and off-season remainders. That discipline, the refusal to chase the cheapest shelf, would define the company for 60 years. It would also become one of the cruelest ironies in the whole story. The brand that Louis Rousk built by avoiding discount channels would, decades after his death, end up positioned exclusively at Walmart. But that was a future nobody on a Manhattan sewing floor in the 1940s could have imagined, and nobody would have believed. What they could see was growth, steady, year-over-year growth. Direct-to-consumer advertising in magazines like Good Housekeeping and McCall's brought the Health-tex name into American homes through the publications mothers already read. The label became familiar in living rooms before it was familiar in boardrooms. By the end of the 1950s, Health-tex had become the best-known brand of young children's clothing in the United States. Not the biggest, not the cheapest, the most trusted. And in children's clothing, trust was the only currency that compounded. We tell the stories of what America built and how it fell apart. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now let's get back to the story. The rise that followed wasn't built on a single innovation or a lucky break. It was built on the same thing Rousk had always understood, that mothers talk to other mothers, and a garment that survived was the best advertisement money couldn't buy. By the early 1960s, Health-tex had moved its production out of Manhattan entirely and into dedicated manufacturing facilities across New England and the South. Plants in Rhode Island, Maine, Alabama, and Virginia turned out a growing volume of children's playwear, each piece cut and sewn in-house, each one carrying the orange Health-tex label that had become as familiar in American nurseries as Johnson's baby powder. The company kept design offices in New York and opened sales showrooms in Dallas, Los Angeles, and Chicago, covering every region where mothers shopped and children grew out of their clothes. By 1967, annual sales had reached $34 million, substantial money for a company that made nothing but children's garments, and a figure that placed Health-tex firmly among the leaders in an industry where most competitors remained small, regional, and unknown outside their own markets. But the numbers alone don't explain what Health-tex had become. The brand had crossed from commerce into something closer to culture, and the instrument of that crossing was an advertising campaign that broke every rule in the children's clothing playbook. In 1966, Health-tex and its agency, AC&R, launched a campaign called The Handy Answers to Hard Questions, asked by children in the Health-tex years. The ads didn't feature models posing in studio light. They didn't spotlight garments laid flat on white backgrounds. They didn't even try to sell clothing in the conventional sense. Instead, they featured childlike, colorful illustrations, the work of artist Susan Pearl, wrapped around the kinds of questions preschoolers actually asked. Why is the sky blue? Where does the sun go at night? What makes thunder? Why do leaves change color? The clothing appeared almost incidentally, worn by the illustrated children in the margins. The real content was the conversation between parent and child. The campaign positioned Health-tex not as a product, but as a companion to early childhood itself. The clothes were there because the children were there, and the children were asking the kinds of questions that made parents pause over the breakfast table. The message was simple and devastating in its effectiveness. Health-tex understood the years when children asked hard questions, because Health-tex had been clothing those years since. Before the parents buying the ads had been children themselves. The response was extraordinary. Parents and school teachers wrote in requesting reprints of the ads, not to keep as brand memorabilia, but to use with their own children. Susan Pearl's illustrations ended up on refrigerator doors and classroom bulletin boards across the country. A clothing advertisement had become, without irony, an educational resource that parents genuinely wanted in their homes. The campaign ran for more than 15 years. Deep into the early 1980s, and it accomplished something no amount of shelf placement or coupon strategy could replicate. It made Health-tex feel like family. Behind the warmth of the ads, the industrial operation was growing sharper and more self-sufficient. Health-tex vertically integrated its production in a way few children's clothing companies attempted or could afford. The company's own knit textile facilities produced roughly 2/3 of the fabric used in its garments, controlling quality from the raw fiber to the finished seam. When a mother pulled a Health-tex romper off a department store rack in Denver or Atlanta or St. Paul, the cotton in that garment had likely been knitted, dyed, cut, and sewn entirely within Health-tex's own walls. That level of control was expensive to build and expensive to maintain, but it was the foundation of the product promise. You couldn't guarantee durability if you couldn't guarantee the cloth. And you couldn't guarantee the cloth if you were buying it on the open market from suppliers whose commitment to your brand ended at the invoice. The manufacturing geography was deliberate. Rhode Island and Maine provided a deep labor pool of skilled textile workers. Communities where sewing and cutting and finishing had been passed down through families, where the muscle memory of the trade was as much a part of the local economy as the pay itself. Alabama and Virginia offered lower costs and proximity to southern cotton markets. New York remained the design and sales nerve center. The whole system was designed to keep production close, quality controlled, and the brand insulated from the supply chain compromises that plagued competitors who outsourced fabric, outsourced sewing, and outsourced the risk of disappointing a mother who'd expected better. Health-tex had also learned the power of scarcity, or at least the appearance of it. Demand outpaced supply often enough that the company had to limit the number of retailers receiving goods and allocate merchandise among regular customers. A buyer for a department store in the Midwest couldn't simply double an order because the brand was selling fast. Health-tex decided how much each store received, and stores accepted those terms because the alternative was losing the line entirely and losing the mothers who came looking for it. In an industry where retailers usually held the leverage over manufacturers, Health-tex had flipped the relationship. The brand was more valuable than the shelf space it occupied. That orange logo, it's stitched into every collar, every waistband, every romper snap, had become one of the most recognizable marks in American children's apparel, not because it was beautiful, not because it was clever, because it meant something mothers could count on. It meant the garment would last. It meant the stitching would hold. It meant the clothes would be there for the next child, and maybe the one after that. And the mother who'd bought them wouldn't have to think about children's clothing again until somebody outgrew the pile. Louis Rousk had built something that functioned less like a clothing company and more like a covenant between a manufacturer and the American family. Health-tex didn't ask for loyalty. It earned it, one laundry cycle at a time. The inside of a Health-tex plant on a Tuesday morning in 1975 didn't look like the advertisements. There were no illustrated children asking questions about the sky, no colorful Susan Pearl artwork, no warm parental glow. There was cotton, there were machines, and there were women, hundreds of them, turning fabric into the garments those ads were selling. The sound hit first, not the thundering roar of a steel mill or the metallic crash of an auto line, but a high, relentless chatter. Hundreds of industrial sewing machines running simultaneously, each one a rapid-fire staccato that merged into a single sustained hum you could feel through the soles of your shoes. Underneath that, the heavier rhythm of the cutting machines, fabric stacked dozens of layers deep on long tables, die cut into pattern pieces by operators who'd learned to read the lay of cotton the way a carpenter reads wood grain. Then the pressing stations, hissing jets of steam that added a wet mineral warmth to the air, mixing with the sharper scent of sewing machine oil and the dry sweetness of fresh sizing on new cloth. Every Health-tex plant had its own particular smell, part laundry, part machine shop, part something that didn't have a name but that anyone who'd ever worked a textile floor would recognize immediately and never forget. The women who ran those machines made up more than 90% of the production workforce. They moved through their stations with the practiced efficiency of people who'd been performing the same motions for years, sometimes decades. A sleeve seam, a collar attachment, a snap fastener pressed into place with a pneumatic punch that fired and reset so fast the motion was nearly invisible. Each operator handled her piece of the garment and passed it down the line, and the garment accumulated, a flat piece of cut fabric becoming, station by station, something a child would wear to a playground, spill juice on, drag through a sandbox, and hand down to a little brother who'd do it all again. In Cumberland, Rhode Island, the Diamond Hill plant at 88 Martin Street anchored its working neighborhood the way a church anchors a parish, not through dramatic gestures, but through daily presence, through the fact of being there, shift after shift, year after year. Charles Alves spent 30 years inside those walls. He worked as an office administrator and yarn buyer at the Health-tex operation, watching the raw materials arrive in bales and bolts, and the finished garments ship out in cartons stamped for department stores he'd never visit. He knew the weight of a cotton bolt by feel. He knew which suppliers delivered consistent dye lots, and which ones sent fabric that would shift shade after the third wash. He tracked the rhythm of the business the way a sailor tracks weather, by feel, by pattern, by the accumulated knowledge that comes only from paying attention to the same operation for a very long time. His career would span the full arc of Health-tex in Rhode Island, from the growth years through the peak, and all the way to the day the Cumberland facility finally closed in 1990. 60 miles up the coast and into Maine, Robert Frazier managed the Gardner plant for 20 years before retiring in 1980. A plant manager in a Health-tex facility didn't sit behind a desk reviewing corporate memos and strategic plans. He walked the floor. He knew the cutting room's daily throughput and the sewing floor's absentee patterns. He knew which machines needed new timing belts and which operators could handle the trickiest seams, the curved collar joins, the inset sleeves, the spots where a quarter-inch deviation meant the garment wouldn't hang right on a 3-year-old's shoulders. The garments that left his plant carried no trace of his name, no evidence of his attention, but they carried his standard, every single one. The work was repetitive and physically demanding, and nobody pretended otherwise. Piece rate systems governed much of the sewing floor. You were paid by the garment, not the hour, which meant speed and precision had to coexist in every motion of every minute. A fast operator who sacrificed quality got pulled aside. A careful operator who couldn't keep pace fell behind on earnings. The balance was the job, and it lived in your hands. The Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union represented Health-tex workers across multiple plants, and Cornell University's labor archives preserve the paper trail of that relationship. Arbitration files, engineering department records, plant-specific documents from Diamond Hill and the Maine, Portland, and Gardner facilities, work standards, piece rates, grievance forms, the bureaucratic record of thousands of small negotiations between management's production targets and workers' wrists, backs, and patience. But for the women who sat at those machines shift after shift, the work carried something alongside the strain that's harder to capture in an archive. They were making something real, not abstractions, not financial instruments, not data entries or insurance claims, children's clothing, garments that would touch a child's skin, get dragged through grass, get washed and folded and packed into drawers and worn again by a smaller sibling who didn't know or care who'd sewn the seams. The product had a life beyond the factory gate that most manufacturing workers never got to witness. A Health-tex seamstress in Gardner could walk into any department store in the country and find her work on the rack, or more likely find that her work had already been bought and was somewhere out in the world, on a child she'd never meet, surviving exactly the way it was designed to survive. The factories ran on a rhythm that organized the towns around them as completely as a tide organizes a harbor. Morning shifts started early, the parking lots filled before sunrise in winter, headlights sweeping across frosted asphalt, the breath of arriving workers visible in cold air as they crossed from their cars to the plant door. The lunch break sent women to break rooms that smelled of reheated coffee and microwaved leftovers. The sewing floor hum replaced for 30 minutes by conversation, laughter, the scrape of chairs, and rustle of sandwich wrappers. Then the machine started again. Friday meant paychecks. Summer meant the children. Those women dressed in Health-tex garments were home from school, playing in backyards, waiting for their mothers to finish the shift and pull into the driveway. The trust didn't stay inside the factory. It moved outward, into homes and stores and laundry rooms, and the quiet calculations mothers made every August when school shopping began. By the late 1970s, Health-tex wasn't just a brand. It was a decision that had already been made. A mother standing in the children's section of a Sears or a Penny's didn't need to inspect the stitching or rub the fabric between her fingers. She looked for the orange label. If it was there, the garment went in the cart. If it wasn't, she compared, considered, and usually paid less for something she trusted less. The brand had achieved something most consumer products never reach, a purchase that didn't require a sales pitch. Trust had replaced persuasion entirely. Robert Breakstone understood the machinery of that trust better than almost anyone inside the company's walls. He'd come to Chesbrough Ponds, the consumer goods conglomerate that had acquired Health-tex, and rose to lead the children's apparel division after earnings had softened in the late 1970s. Breakstone was a systems man, not a fabric man. He reorganized production schedules, streamlined inventory management, fixed the distribution bottlenecks that had slowed shipments to retailers, and pushed Health-tex into new product categories, activewear for children, expanded size ranges for older kids who'd previously aged out of the brand by their 7th birthday. Under his leadership, Health-tex didn't just maintain its position in a competitive market, it grew into territory the company had never claimed before. And the numbers told a story that should have been impossible in the fragmented world of American children's apparel. By 1983, Health-tex sales had surpassed $300 million, Operating profits were running near 40 million. The brand's share of the market, a market where no single company was supposed to dominate, where regional labels and private brands and cheap imports from Asia split the business into 1,000 slivers, had reached roughly 35%. One in every three children's garments sold in America carried the Health-tex name. The closest competitor, the William Carter Company, trailed far behind. To understand what 35% meant, consider the arithmetic of the children's clothing market itself. The entire industry was generating somewhere around $1 billion in sales annually, and it was one of the most fragmented corners of the American apparel business. Hundreds of manufacturers, local, regional, imported, competed for shelf space and a mother's attention. Nobody was supposed to own a third of that market. Department stores stocked multiple brands precisely because mothers had different tastes, different budgets, different ideas about what a 2-year-old should wear to daycare. And yet, Health-tex held a position so dominant that retailers treated the brand less like a product line and more like a department in itself. That dominance hadn't come from undercutting anyone on price. It hadn't come from flooding discount shelves with marked down inventory. It came from 60 years of accumulated trust, reinforced every time a garment survived another child, another laundry cycle, another season of playground knees and grass-stained overalls, and spilled lunches that would have ruined a lesser piece of fabric. Chesebro Pond's chief executive, Ralph Ward, had assembled a diversified consumer products portfolio that stretched from Pond's cold cream to Ragu pasta sauce to Bass shoes and Prince tennis rackets. Health-tex was the crown of the empire's apparel division, profitable, growing, trusted by consumers in a way that no amount of marketing spend could manufacture from scratch. In 1984, Chesebro acquired Imperial Reading Corporation and folded its Britannia children's clothing brand into Health-tex, expanding the division's market coverage further still. That same year, Health-tex won approval to open a Canadian subsidiary for retail outlets, a move that signaled management was still thinking about growth, about expansion, about pushing into markets the brand hadn't yet saturated. Nobody in the executive suite was preparing for retreat. The company employed approximately 9,000 workers across 16 manufacturing plants. The integrated production system, its own textile mills feeding its own cutting and sewing operations, remained intact and running at capacity. The product was still overwhelmingly made in America, in American plants, by American workers whose hands touched the garments that American mothers trusted. That fact would matter in ways that nobody could fully measure until the production was gone and the trust it had built was living on borrowed time. In the communities where Health-tex plants operated, the company's stability had shaped the economic landscape the way a river shapes a valley. Slowly, thoroughly, so completely that the terrain seemed like it had always been that way. In Cumberland, Rhode Island, the Diamond Hill plant was a fixed point in the neighborhood's geography. In Maine, Health-tex operations in Gardner and Portland provided steady employment in communities where the practical choices were the mill, the service economy, or the highway south toward Boston. The women who worked those sewing floors had built lives around the assumption that the work would continue. Mortgages timed to paychecks, school pickups organized around shift calendars, family arrangements that depended on the factory running the way it had always run. That assumption wasn't naive. It was earned by 6 decades of continuous operation. Health-tex had survived the Depression, the Second World War, import competition, fashion cycles that killed lesser brands, and every recession the American economy had produced since the year Louis Rousk rented his first floor in Manhattan. The company stood as proof that if you made something well enough, and if mothers trusted it deeply enough, the market would sustain you. What no one on a sewing floor in Cumberland or Gardner could know was that the company's greatest strength, its value, its profitability, its brand equity, had become its greatest vulnerability. Health-tex was worth a lot of money, and in the financial climate of the mid-1980s, anything worth a lot of money was worth borrowing against, restructuring, and, if the math worked out on paper, taking apart. The peak was 1983, maybe 1984. The exact year depends on which number you choose. Sales, profits, market share, but they all converge on the same summit. $300 million in revenue, $40 million in operating profit, 35% of the children's apparel market, 16 plants, 9,000 workers. A brand so deeply embedded in American parenting that it had outlived the childhood of the generation buying it. Mothers who'd worn Health-tex as toddlers were now buying Health-tex for their own children. The cycle had closed. The brand was self-perpetuating. Breakstone's operational overhaul had paid off handsomely. New product lines for older children opened a market segment Health-tex had never served. Activewear, tracksuits, athletic cut separates caught the early 80s fitness wave and brought the brand into categories where it could grow without cannibalizing its core infant and toddler business. Distribution was tight. Inventory moved efficiently through the system. Retailers competed for allocation the way they always had, because losing the Health-tex line meant losing the mothers who walked in looking for it. The annual reports projected confidence. The Canadian subsidiary, new product lines, expanded size ranges. The language was the language of a company that believed its best years were still ahead. Capital investment plans, growth projections, the vocabulary of ascent. Nobody writing those reports was preparing for a fall. Nobody reading them had reason to expect one. But confidence is not the same as control, and profits at Health-tex had already softened slightly from the 1983 peak, down about 10%, even before anyone outside the executive suite had reason to worry. Fashion was beginning to shift. The children's apparel market was growing more competitive, more style conscious, and the department stores and specialty shops that carried Health-tex were increasingly using fashion-forward children's clothing to differentiate themselves from discount competitors. Health-tex's strength had always been durability, not trend. That distinction, which had been an asset for 60 years, was beginning to feel like a constraint. None of this was fatal. A 10% dip in a company generating $300 million in revenue was a problem, not a crisis. But it arrived at exactly the wrong moment, because the forces gathering outside Health-tex's walls had nothing to do with fashion cycles or children's clothing. They had to do with corporate debt, hostile takeovers, and the particular financial logic that descended on American boardrooms in the mid-1980s. Like weather nobody had forecast. Chesebro Pons was changing. Ralph Ward, the man who'd assembled the consumer products conglomerate, was facing pressures that lived entirely outside the children's clothing market. The mid-1980s were the age of the hostile takeover, the leveraged buyout, the corporate raid. Chesebro, profitable, diversified, conservatively managed, sitting on valuable brand assets, was exactly the kind of company that raiders targeted. Ward needed to make the company too expensive to acquire or too leveraged to be worth the fight. His solution would be a billion-dollar bet that would reshape everything underneath it. The sewing machines in Cumberland and Gardner and a dozen other plants were still running. The cutting rooms were still turning bolts of cotton into pattern pieces. The pressing stations were still sending steam into the air. The orange labels were still being stitched into collars by women who could do the motion without looking. The parking lots were still full at shift change. From the factory floor, everything looked the way it had looked for decades. Stable, productive, built to last. But the decisions that would empty those parking lots, silence those machines, and scatter those workers into a labor market that had no place for their skills were already being made in rooms that smelled of nothing. No cotton, no sizing starch, no sewing machine oil, no steam from the pressing stations, just paper and possibility and the particular American faith that a spreadsheet could see further than a factory floor ever could. The company had spent 60 years teaching parents that Health-tex could survive anything a child could do to it. It hadn't been built to survive what borrowed money could do. The trouble didn't start in children's clothing. It didn't start on a sewing floor or in a cutting room or anywhere near the orange label. It started in the kind of boardroom where the air smells like nothing at all, and the decisions are measured in units that have no texture, no weight, no sound, only zeros. In 1985, Ralph Ward made a bet. He'd spent years building Chesebro Pons into a diversified consumer products company. Pons Cold Cream, Ragu, Bass Shoes, Prince Rackets, Health-tex, a portfolio designed to cushion one division's stumble with another's strength. It was the logic of an era that believed diversification was defense. But defense against what? In the mid-1980s, The answer was the hostile takeover. Corporate raiders had turned the Fortune 500 into a hunting ground. Companies with strong brands, steady cash flow, and conservative balance sheets were not strengths in this new landscape. They were targets. Ward's response was to make Chesebro too expensive to swallow. In 1985, he authorized the purchase of Stauffer Chemical Company for $1.25 billion. It was the kind of deal that looked decisive on a press release and devastating on a balance sheet. Chesebro Pond's debt rose to roughly 73% of total capital, a number that transformed a conservatively managed company into one that needed to sell things to breathe. And Health-tex was the most sellable thing Chesebro owned. The children's clothing division was profitable. It was identifiable. It had a brand name that any buyer in the consumer products world would recognize. And it was separable. You could carve it out of the parent company without disrupting the ragu jars or the Pond's bottles. For a conglomerate drowning in acquisition debt, Health-tex wasn't a crown jewel anymore. It was a life raft. Robert Breakstone saw his chance. He'd spent years running Health-tex, reorganizing its systems, pushing its market share to historic levels. He knew the brand's value better than anyone in a Chesebro boardroom. Knew it not as a line on a balance sheet, but as a living system of factories, workers, suppliers, and retail relationships that together produced something mothers trusted. In June 1985, Breakstone and a group of investors reached a deal to acquire Health-tex from Chesebro Ponds through a leveraged buyout. The acquisition would be financed primarily with borrowed money, debt that the company itself, through its own revenue and operating profits, would be responsible for repaying. The brand's strength was simultaneously the justification for the purchase and the collateral against which the purchase was leveraged. Health-tex was being used to buy itself. At the time of the buyout, Health-tex employed roughly 9,000 workers in 16 plants spread across Rhode Island, Maine, Alabama, and Virginia. It was still generating hundreds of millions in annual revenue. It was still the most trusted name in American children's clothing, with the market share to prove it. On paper, the deal made a kind of sense that the mid-1980s financial climate rewarded. Use the brand's strength as collateral, service the debt with operating profits, trim what you could, and emerge on the other side as an independent company unshackled from a conglomerate that no longer wanted you. Hundreds of American companies were being restructured through the same mechanism in the same years. The logic was everywhere. It was in the air. It was the way things were done. But the deal had a flaw built into its foundation. The debt didn't care about trust. It didn't care about orange labels or the quality of cotton or how many mothers reached for the brand without thinking. Debt cared about payments. Monthly, quarterly, annually. Payments that came due whether the fashion market cooperated or not, whether department stores reordered or not, whether the American economy held or stumbled, and the American children's apparel market wasn't standing still. It was shifting beneath Health-tex's feet in ways that the company's traditional strengths couldn't address, and the debt made it impossible to adapt. Fashion cycles were quickening. The slow, durable, season-after-season rhythm that had made Health-tex dominant was beginning to feel out of step with a retail environment that increasingly rewarded novelty over endurance. Department stores and specialty shops were using fashion-forward children's clothing, brighter colors, trendier cuts, garments designed to be replaced next season rather than handed down to a younger sibling, as a way to differentiate themselves from discount competitors. A children's clothing buyer at a mid-tier department store in 1986 wasn't looking for the same things she'd been looking for in 1976. She wanted product that would pull mothers into the store, and pulling mothers into the store now meant offering something new, not something familiar. Health-tex's identity was durability. The market was beginning to demand disposability. The two impulses were nearly irreconcilable, and the debt left no room to experiment with bridging the gap. Import competition was pressing from below with a persistence that no tariff or branding strategy could entirely counter. Cheaper children's garments from overseas manufacturers, companies that didn't carry the cost of American labor, American plants, American benefits, or American vertical integration, were arriving on retail shelves at price points that Health-tex couldn't match, without abandoning the quality standard that justified its premium. The domestic apparel industry as a whole was entering the years that labor historians would later describe as devastating. a slow-motion erosion of manufacturing capacity that hollowed out textile communities from the Carolinas to New England and eliminated hundreds of thousands of garment industry jobs in a single decade. Health-tex wasn't immune to that current. It was swimming against it, and the LBO debt had just tied weights to its ankles. Profits had already softened about 10% from the 1983 peak before the buyout papers were signed. That decline wasn't catastrophic, not for a company generating $300 million in revenue, but it mattered enormously in a leveraged structure where every dollar of operating profit was spoken for. The cushion between revenue and debt service was thin, and it was getting thinner. Inside Health-tex, the squeeze arrived as a set of impossible choices. The debt demanded cost reduction, but the costs lived inside the factories, in the wages, the benefits, the union contracts, the maintenance of machines that needed replacing, the textile mills that produced two-thirds of the company's own fabric. Every dollar saved on the factory floor was a dollar that risked weakening the product. And the product, the quality, the durability, the feel of the cotton and the strength of the stitching, was the only thing holding the brand together. Cut the costs that maintained the quality, and you cut the reason mothers reached for the label, but failed to cut costs, and the lenders who'd financed the buyout would do the cutting for you. There was no good option. There was only the next payment. The sewing machines were still running, the cutting rooms were still turning bolts into pattern pieces, the orange labels were still being stitched into collars, but the machines were running now to service debt, not to build a brand. And the women operating them, the women who'd spent years and decades turning cotton into something a mother could trust, were about to discover what it meant to be the cost standing between borrowed money and the people who'd lent it. The decisions came fast, and they came from the top, and each one seemed to follow logically from the one before it. That's how it works. No single choice looked monstrous on its own. Each one was a response to the last, a narrowing of options that began the moment the debt papers were signed. By the time the consequences reached the factory floor, the logic had acquired the weight of necessity. The first decision was Ralph Ward's. The Stauffer chemical acquisition in 1985 loaded Chesbrough Ponds with $1.25 billion in new obligations, pushing the company's debt to roughly 73% of total capital. Ward believed he was protecting Chesbrough from the corporate raiders who'd been circling mid-1980s conglomerates like sharks, sensing weakness. And by the logic of the moment, the defense made sense. A company burdened with enough debt becomes too expensive to swallow, too leveraged to be worth the fight. What the logic didn't account for was the collateral damage. Ward's defensive move required Chesbrough to sell profitable divisions to service the Stauffer debt. Health-tex, stable, identifiable, separable from the rest of the conglomerate, was the most obvious candidate for divestiture. The workers in Cumberland and Gardner and Portland and a dozen other plants didn't know it yet, but their daily output, every romper, every pair of cotton pants, every collar with an orange label stitched into it, had just been pledged as collateral for someone else's survival strategy. A decision made to protect a conglomerate from Wall Street raiders had converted a children's clothing company into an asset to be liquidated. The second decision was Breakstone's, the leveraged buyout itself. Breakstone had run Health-tex well. Nobody could dispute that. His operational improvements were real. The market share gains were real. The $300 million in revenue was real. But a leveraged buyout converts operating profit into debt service, and the margin for error shrinks to almost nothing. A company that could absorb a bad quarter inside Chesbrough's diversified balance sheet now had to make every payment on time, every quarter, from its own cash flow alone. There was no parent company to absorb a shock. There was no portfolio of other brands to cushion a stumble. There was only Health-tex, its factories, its workers, and the debt they now existed to pay. Breakstone believed the brand was strong enough to carry the load. He'd spent years watching Health-tex generate cash with remarkable consistency, and the financial projections said it could keep generating. What the projections couldn't model was the speed at which the children's apparel market was shifting beneath his feet, or the cost of maintaining 16 plants and 9,000 workers while simultaneously feeding interest payments to lenders who had no interest in children's clothing and every interest in their quarterly returns. The projections assumed a stable market. The market had stopped being stable. The third decision, and the one that would become the emotional center of this story, was the closing of the Maine plants. In January 1987, Health-tex abruptly closed 3 manufacturing facilities in Maine. More than 1,000 workers were affected. The vast majority of them, more than 90%, were women. Women who had spent years, in some cases decades, sitting at industrial sewing machines and cutting tables, producing children's clothing for a company that had always presented itself as a partner in the American family. It was, by the measures that labor economists and state agencies use to track such events, the largest single plant closing Maine had experienced in the entire decade of the 1980s. The closings weren't announced months in advance, with relocation assistance and gradual wind-down programs, and the cushioned corporate language of managed transition. They arrived the way a door closes, suddenly, completely, and with the sound of something locking behind you. One day, the parking lots were full, and the machines were running, and the break rooms smelled of coffee. The next day, they weren't. Women who'd spent years at sewing machines, building children's garments, stitch by stitch, seam by seam, were told the work was being moved to other facilities, somewhere cheaper. Somewhere the debt could breathe. The Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union didn't accept it quietly. In February 1987, ACTWU filed a federal lawsuit in New York to prevent Health-tex from closing the 3 Maine plants and shipping the work elsewhere. The union's legal team argued that the closings violated existing labor agreements, that a company couldn't simply lock the doors and move the jobs without honoring the contracts that governed the relationship between management and the workers who'd made the company profitable. The argument was sound, but a lawsuit moves at the speed of courts and depositions and legal briefs, and plant closings move at the speed of disconnected power lines and trucks loaded with equipment. By the time the legal arguments were being assembled into filings, the machines in Maine were already cold. Here is the fact that sits at the center of this chapter like a stone dropped into still water. Health-tex reported record sales of $347 million in 1986. Record sales, the highest figure in the company's 65-year history. The year before the Maine closings, Health-tex moved more product through more retail stores and into more American homes than it ever had. The plants weren't closed because the brand was failing. They weren't closed because mothers had stopped buying. They weren't closed because the garments had lost their reputation or the orange label had lost its meaning. They were closed because the debt structure required a company generating record revenue to cut operating costs faster than it was generating cash to service the interest on money it had borrowed to buy itself. The workers in Maine weren't casualties of a declining market. They were casualties of a balance sheet. The fourth decision was the broader contraction that followed the Maine closings like an aftershock. With Breakstone's original operational strategy overwhelmed by debt service, and with the Maine closings having demonstrated that the company's leadership was willing to cut deep and fast, the closures continued. Plant after plant went dark. The process had its own terrible momentum. Each closure reduced revenue capacity, which increased the pressure to cut costs further, which led to the next closure. The math was circular and merciless. Alabama, Virginia, Rhode Island. One by one, the communities that had organized around Health-tex's presence lost the organizing principle itself. The local economies didn't collapse overnight. People found other work, or they didn't, or they moved. But the anchor was gone, and without the anchor, the tide of daily life lost its rhythm. By 1988, Health-tex had gone from 16 manufacturing facilities to 5. From 9,000 workers to a fraction of that number. More than half the workforce, thousands of workers across multiple states, the overwhelming majority of them women who had spent years developing skills that had no portable market value outside the garment industry, had been laid off in roughly 3 years. The factories that had anchored their communities for decades, that had organized towns around their shift schedules and their paychecks and their parking lots, closed in a sequence that looked less like a business restructuring and more like a controlled demolition of the very system that had made Health-tex worth owning in the first place. Breakstone resigned. The exact circumstances of his departure are less well documented than the consequences of his tenure, but the arithmetic is clear enough. The man who'd led Health-tex to record market share, who'd believed the brand's strength could carry the debt, had watched the company shed two-thirds of its plants and thousands of its workers while the debt he'd taken on consumed the operating capacity he'd spent years building. He left, and the company brought in Gilbert C. Osmos. Osmos was a turnaround specialist. The job title said everything about what Health-tex had become. Not a children's clothing company building trust one garment at a time, but a problem to be solved, a patient to be stabilized, a set of assets to be rationalized until someone was willing to buy them. Osmos simplified the product line dramatically, cut the number of styles Health-tex offered, refocused what remained on fashion basics, a term that would have been meaningless to Louis Rousk, who'd built the company on the idea that a children's garment could be both basic and exceptional, and began looking for a buyer. He also did something Rousk had spent his entire career refusing to do. He considered discount distribution channels. Kids, R Us, and other lower-tier retailers entered the conversation as potential partners. The brand that had been built on the principle that context mattered, that Health-tex belonged in the stores where mothers expected quality, not on the racks where they expected bargains, was now being shopped to the very stores Rousk had spent 60 years deliberately avoiding. The fifth decision was the sale itself. In 1991, VF Corporation agreed to purchase substantially all of Health-tex's remaining operating assets for an estimated $29 million. VF was a major apparel conglomerate. Lee Jeans, Wrangler, Janssen, Gerbeau, Vanity Fair, a company built on the business of buying brands and running them lean. They knew what they were getting and what they were paying for it. $29 million. For a brand that had generated $347 million in annual revenue just 5 years earlier. For a company that had once employed 9,000 workers in 16 plants across 4 states. For the most trusted name in American children's clothing, a name that had been built over 60 years by a founder who'd understood that you earned a mother's loyalty one garment at a time. $29 million was not a purchase price. It was a salvage figure. It was the number the market assigned to what remained after the leveraged buyout had extracted everything the leverage could reach. The plants, the workers, the equipment, the vertical integration, the manufacturing system that had made the brand worth trusting in the first place. The workers who'd made all of it possible, the women in Maine and Rhode Island and Alabama and Virginia who'd sewn the garments that built the brand that justified the buyout, that loaded the debt that closed the plants, were not part of the transaction. They were already gone. Their labor had made Health-tex worth buying in 1985. Their absence made it cheap enough to buy again in 1991. January in Maine is a particular kind of cold, not the dry, sharp cold of the Midwest or the theatrical cold of a mountain pass. A wet cold, a coastal cold that gets into your clothes and your joints and the concrete walls of a factory building and doesn't leave until April. The women who worked the Health-tex plants in Maine knew that cold. They knew the walk from the parking lot to the plant door in the dark, the way the warmth of the sewing floor hit your face when you stepped inside, the hum of the machine starting up like a building drawing its first breath of the day. In January 1987, that breath stopped. 3 plants, more than 1,000 workers, 90% of them women. The closings didn't arrive with the slow, legible decline that gives people time to adjust. The gradual reduction in shifts, the whispered rumors that circulate through break rooms like smoke, the voluntary buyouts offered to senior workers, the months of dread that at least give you time to prepare. They arrived fast and final. 1 week the lines were running, and the parking lot was full, and the coffee was brewing in the break room. The next week the lights were off and the doors were locked, and the women who'd been sewing garments on Monday were standing in line at the unemployment office by Friday. Women who had organized their lives around the assumption that the plant would be open tomorrow, the mortgage payment timed to the next paycheck, the babysitter arranged around the shift schedule, the car payment that depended on the overtime being there, found out that the assumption had been wrong and that nobody had thought to warn them before the assumption became irrelevant. The labor market in the communities where those plants operated was running at 2 to 3% unemployment, numbers that on paper suggested everything was fine. The regional economy was healthy. Jobs existed. Official statistics said so. But official statistics don't distinguish between a sewing floor job that paid a living wage with union protection, benefits, and the accumulated seniority of a decade's tenure, and a service sector position at a retail counter or a fast food franchise that paid less per hour, offered no benefits worth mentioning, and treated experience as irrelevant. The women who lost their jobs at Health-tex didn't step into equivalent work. There was no equivalent work to step into. The skills that had made them valuable on a sewing floor, the speed, the precision, the ability to run a seam that would survive 100 washes, had no transferable market value in a regional economy that was building its future on tourism, retail, and healthcare, not manufacturing. A CTWU's federal lawsuit tried to stop the closings. The union filed in New York in February 1987, arguing that the company couldn't unilaterally shut down plants and transfer work to other facilities while labor agreements were in force. The legal argument was about contract rights, about the obligations a company takes on when it signs an agreement with the workers who make its product. It was the right argument made in the right court by a union that understood what was at stake. But the timing was impossible. Courts deliberate. They file motions, schedule hearings, request briefs, consider precedent. Plant closings don't wait for any of that. The machines were disconnected. The cutting tables were cleared. The pressing stations went cold. The steam that had filled those rooms for years. The wet, mineral warmth that was the first thing you noticed when you walked in, and the last thing you stopped noticing because it had become as constant as the hum of the machines. Dissipated and didn't come back. The silence settled into buildings that had been designed for noise, buildings whose walls and floors and ventilation systems had been constructed specifically to contain the sound of hundreds of machines running simultaneously. Not a peaceful silence, not the quiet of a library or a Sunday morning. The silence of a place that was supposed to be loud, where the sudden absence of the hum that had been constant for decades felt less like quiet and more like a wound in the air. The kind of silence that people who've worked in factories their whole lives describe as the strangest part of a closing. Not the lost paycheck, not the locked door, but the moment you realize the building has stopped breathing. A research team from the University of Southern Maine later studied the aftermath with unusual rigor. They contacted the displaced Health-tex workers, 453 of them, representing nearly 92% of the entire affected population. That response rate alone tells a story. These women wanted to be counted. They wanted someone to document what had happened to them because the official narrative, the press releases, the corporate language of restructuring and operational efficiency had described their disappearance from the payroll without describing their lives. The researchers wanted to know what happened after the plant door locked, what problems persisted months and years later, whether government retraining programs helped or didn't, whether new jobs matched old ones in wages, benefits, and dignity, whether the women who'd spent years building children's clothing had found anything on the other side of the closing that resembled what they'd lost. The findings were what anyone who's lived through a plant closing already suspects, even before the data confirms it. Lower wages, fewer benefits, the loss of seniority that had taken years to accumulate and couldn't be transferred to a new employer. Broken social networks, the women who'd worked side by side for years, who'd shared break rooms and carpools, and the particular solidarity of people doing the same hard, repetitive, skilled work in the same room for the same company were scattered across a labor market that had no use for their solidarity and no place for their skills. Some found new jobs that paid less and demanded different things. Some found nothing that fit. Some discovered that a decade of sewing experience listed on an application for a cashier position was worth exactly nothing to an employer who needed someone to operate a register. The irony, and it sat heavy over the whole aftermath like the Maine winter itself, was that Health-tex garments were still on store shelves, while the women who'd made them were filling out job applications. The brand survived the closings. The products survived the closings. The orange label still meant something to mothers browsing department store racks in cities where no one had heard of the plants that closed. The clothes held up, the workers were let go, and the gap between those two facts was the entire story. Meanwhile, in the remaining plants, the contraction continued its slow, systematic work. Rhode Island, the Diamond Hill plant in Cumberland, where Charles Alves had spent 3 decades buying yarn and tracking quality, the operation that had anchored that neighborhood since before most of its current residents had been born. By 1990, it was closed. Alves retired, not because he'd chosen to, not because he'd reached a date on a calendar that he and the company had agreed upon, but because the place where he'd built his entire working life no longer existed. 30 years of knowing the weight of a cotton bolt by feel, 30 years of tracking dye lots and supplier consistency, 30 years of daily attention to the rhythm of a factory that had been running since long before he arrived. All of it reduced to a retirement that came on someone else's schedule, for someone else's reasons, on behalf of a debt he'd had no part in creating and no power to prevent. By the time VF Corporation signed the purchase agreement in 1991, Health-tex had already been hollowed from the inside out. The 16 plants were mostly dark. The 9,000 workers were mostly scattered. The vertical integration that had been the company's great structural achievement, the textile mills, the cutting rooms, the sewing floors, the pressing stations, the whole interconnected system that allowed a single company to control quality from raw fiber to finished garment, was dismantled, sold off, shut down, reduced to equipment inventories and real estate listings. What VF bought for $29 million was a name, an orange label, a memory of trust that still lived in the minds of American mothers who had no idea what had happened inside the company that had earned that trust. VF bought the ghost of something that had once been real, and they were experienced enough in the business of American apparel to know that ghosts, if properly managed, can still sell clothes. VF Corporation moved Health-tex's management functions to its headquarters in Greensboro, North Carolina. They dropped the hyphen. Health-tex now, one word, a small cosmetic change that nonetheless signaled a larger truth. This was a different company wearing a familiar name. VF reworked the logo, invested in computer-aided design systems that could turn out new styles faster than the old pattern and cut process, launched a $3 million advertising campaign aimed at reintroducing the brand to a generation of mothers who might have heard the name but didn't know what had happened behind it, and set about doing what VF did best: running a brand lean, fast, and profitable without the overhead of the manufacturing system that had built it. It worked, in the narrow way that these things work. By 1993, sales were up nearly 80% from the post-acquisition low. The brand was moving product again. The name still carried weight with mothers, even mothers who didn't know that the garments they were buying were no longer made in the same plants, by the same workers, from the same fabric produced on the same company-owned textile mills that had once controlled every step from fiber to finished seam. The trust that Health-tex had spent 60 years building was still in the account. VF was spending it, but VF didn't rebuild the old factory system. That was never part of the plan, and no one at VF pretended it was. The vertical integration that Louis Rousk had spent decades constructing, the knitting mills that produced the company's own cloth, the cutting rooms in Cumberland, the sewing floors in Gardner, the pressing stations and packing lines that turned cotton into boxed garments ready for a department store shelf, none of that came back. VF ran the brand. They designed the clothes. They marketed the name. They didn't run the factories because the factories were gone, and rebuilding them would have meant rebuilding a cost structure that the modern apparel industry had spent a decade learning to avoid. In December 1990, even before the VF acquisition was finalized, ACTWW and VF had reached a tentative 3-year labor agreement concerning the remaining union-represented Health-tex employees. The union was still there, still fighting for the workers who remained. But what remained was a fraction of what had been: a handful of plants, a reduced workforce, a company that had been bought not for its manufacturing capacity, but for the 4 syllables of its name. In the towns where the old plants had operated, the aftermath followed the pattern that anyone who studies American deindustrialization would recognize. The buildings stayed. The people adapted, or tried to. The local economy found new sources of revenue, or it didn't, or it found sources that paid less and meant less, and organized the community around nothing in particular, instead of around the rhythm of a shift whistle and a steady paycheck. In Cumberland, Rhode Island, the Diamond Hill plant at 88 Martin Street eventually appeared in EPA environmental records as an inactive facility, a line in a federal database where a neighborhood landmark used to be. Across Roosevelt Avenue from one of the old Health-tex buildings, the space was later occupied by Elizabeth Webbing, A different company making a different product in a structure that still carried the industrial bones of its previous life. The walls were the same walls, the loading docks were the same loading docks. What had changed was everything that happened inside them. In Maine, the communities that had absorbed the January 1987 closings moved forward the way American industrial communities always move forward after a closing. Slowly, unevenly, with the weight of what happened sitting beneath the surface of daily life, like ledge rock beneath topsoil. The researchers who'd surveyed those 453 displaced workers had documented the immediate aftermath with unusual thoroughness. The longer aftermath, the years of lower wages, the question of whether pensions were honored or quietly reduced, the generation of women who'd expected to retire from those sewing floors and instead had to reinvent their working lives in their 40s and 50s. That story lived in kitchen table conversations and family budgets and the quiet private arithmetic of what a life costs when the job you counted on is gone. The brand kept moving, changing hands with the ease that brands do when they've been separated from the people and places that built them. In 2004, a company called Lollytogs purchased the Health-tex children's clothing business from VF's subsidiary, VF Playwear. The brand changed hands again, from a major conglomerate to a smaller apparel operator, another transaction that had nothing to do with factories or sewing floors or the women who'd once made the garments by hand. LT Apparel now lists Health-tex as part of its brand portfolio and describes it as exclusively available at Walmart. Walmart, the discount channel that Louis Rousk had spent his entire career keeping Health-tex away from. The shelves he'd believed would cheapen the name he'd spent 2 decades building. The retail context he'd refused, store after store, decade after decade, because he understood. With the certainty of a man who'd sold garments face to face and watched what happened when a trusted brand appeared in the wrong setting, that where a product was sold shaped what it meant. The brand he protected from those racks for 60 years now lived on them permanently, not because the strategy had failed, not because Rousk had been wrong, but because everyone who'd understood the strategy was gone, and the people who remained understood something entirely different. They understood volume. They understood margin. They understood that a name with residual trust could move units at a price point that had nothing to do with the quality the trust was originally built on. What happens to a promise when the people who made it are no longer in the room? Somewhere in America, right now, there's a box in a closet that hasn't been opened in years. A moving box, maybe, or a plastic bin shoved to the back of a shelf during a house reorganization that was supposed to be temporary, but became permanent the way these things do. Inside that box, folded between old blankets and baby books, is a child's garment. Cotton. Sturdy. The snap closures still work. The fabric hasn't thinned. The color has faded just enough to prove that it was washed 100 times and survived every one. The label in the collar is soft with age, but the words are still there. Health-tex. The garment was made by a woman whose name nobody remembers, on a sewing floor that no longer exists, in a factory that may now be a vacant lot, or a warehouse for someone else's products, or a line item in an EPA database. She sat at a machine and ran a seam. One of thousands she ran that week. One of hundreds of thousands she ran in a career that ended, not because she chose to stop, but because someone in a room she'd never entered signed a paper she'd never read. The cotton came from a textile mill the company used to own. The pattern was cut in a room that smelled of sizing starch and machine oil. The snap was pressed into place with a pneumatic punch by a woman who could do it 3,000 times a day without thinking, because the motion had become part of her hands the way a pianist's scales become part of their fingers. All of that is gone. The mill, the cutting room, the sewing floor, the pressing station, the plant, the parking lot that filled before dawn, the break room that smelled of coffee, the paycheck on Friday, the shift whistle that organized a town around its sound. The garment is still here. That's the thing about Health-tex. The product kept its promise. The clothes were indestructible or close enough that the difference didn't matter. They survived toddlers, siblings, cousins, neighbors, garage sales, donation bins, and decades in boxes that nobody remembered to open. The fabric held, the stitching held, the label held. What didn't hold was the world that made it possible. The factories, the wages, the communities organized around the work. The covenant between a company and the people whose hands built its reputation. The understanding that if you showed up and did the work would be there tomorrow, and the paycheck would follow, and the garment you made would carry something of your labor into a life you'd never see, but could be proud of anyway. The clothes lasted. The covenant didn't. Not because it was weak, but because it was never the part anyone thought they needed to protect. The fabric, yes. The stitching, yes. The label, yes. The orange logo and the magazine ads, and the trust of 1 million American mothers. All of that was guarded, maintained, defended. But not the women at the machines. Not the plant managers who walked the floors. Not the yarn buyers who knew the weight of a cotton bolt by feel. Not the towns that set their clocks to the shift whistle. Those were the parts of the system that a spreadsheet couldn't see, and so those were the parts that disappeared first and most completely, and with the least ceremony. The garment in the box doesn't know any of this. It just sits there, folded, doing what it was built to do. Lasting. Outlasting the child who wore it, the company that made it, the factory that sewed it, and the workers whose hands, for a while, made something worth keeping.